If you ever wake up wearing someone else's fate, never trust the smile waiting at the altar. That impossible thought flashed through Ethan Carter's mind before he even opened his eyes. The scent of fresh lilies drifted through the room, mixed with polished cedar and the faint aroma of tea cooling beside an untouched breakfast. Sunlight spilled through towering palace windows, casting long golden beams across a floor so flawless it reflected every detail of the elegant chamber. None of it belonged to him. Ethan sat upright so quickly that the embroidered silver blanket slipped into his lap. His heartbeat echoed in his ears while unfamiliar memories collided with his own. This wasn't his apartment in Chicago. This wasn't even his world. The ornate mirror across the room revealed a young man with porcelain skin, soft silver hair, and striking blue eyes that widened in exactly the same confusion Ethan felt. A quiet gasp escaped his lips. He recognized that face immediately because he had spent hours reading about it only the night before. It belonged to Lucian Ashcroft, the infamous Silent Omega bride, the villain everyone loved to hate in the fantasy novel he had finished after work. Except Lucian was never supposed to survive. According to the story, the wedding day marked the beginning of his tragic downfall, ending only weeks later after a chain of misunderstandings and political schemes destroyed every chance he had to defend himself. Ethan remembered closing the novel while complaining that the character deserved a better ending. Apparently, the universe had listened a little too literally. A gentle knock interrupted his racing thoughts before a maid entered with perfect posture. "My lord, the ceremony begins in 1 hour. His Imperial Majesty is already preparing." Ethan nearly forgot how to breathe. 1 hour. Just 1 hour before marrying the Alpha Emperor Adrian Blackwood, the most feared and respected ruler on the continent. Ethan remembered every description from the novel. Adrian was calm, brilliant, impossible to deceive, and famous for making decisions that shaped entire kingdoms. Yet beneath that composed exterior, rumors painted him as emotionally distant, treating political marriages as necessary duties rather than romances. None of that frightened Ethan nearly as much as remembering what happened after the wedding. If history repeated itself, Lucian would become the convenient target for every noble family's ambition. Every whispered accusation, every carefully planted rumor, every misunderstanding would point directly toward him until no one questioned the verdict. Ethan swung his legs over the edge of the enormous bed and stood carefully, studying the luxurious white ceremonial clothing waiting nearby. It looked impossibly expensive, decorated with delicate silver embroidery that shimmered whenever sunlight touched the fabric. Beautiful clothes for someone walking toward disaster. "No," Ethan whispered to his reflection. "I'm not following that script." His voice sounded softer than expected, but the determination behind it surprised even himself. If he already knew the ending, then he could change it. He would avoid every trap, refuse every pointless argument, and stay as invisible as possible until he found a way home. Survive first. Ask impossible questions later. It sounded like a simple plan. As palace attendants adjusted his ceremonial cloak and guided him through endless marble corridors toward the imperial chapel, Ethan silently repeated those words like a promise. Stay quiet. Stay careful. Stay alive. He had no idea that before the ceremony even ended, the Alpha Emperor waiting beyond those grand doors would hear every single secret Ethan desperately tried to keep locked inside his own mind. The massive bronze doors of the Imperial Chapel opened with slow, deliberate grace, revealing hundreds of nobles already waiting beneath towering crystal chandeliers. Their elegant clothing shimmered with silver threads and jeweled embroidery, yet none of their polite smiles reached their eyes. Ethan could almost feel their curiosity pressing against him as every guest turned to watch the infamous Silent Omega bride walk toward the altar. Keep your head down, he reminded himself. Smile politely. Do not attract attention. That alone should be enough to survive today. Each measured step echoed across the polished marble floor while musicians played a melody that sounded both majestic and strangely lonely. At the end of the long aisle stood Adrian Blackwood. He looked exactly as Ethan remembered from the novel, impossibly composed, dressed in a perfectly tailored black ceremonial uniform trimmed with gold, his dark hair neatly combed. his calm gray eyes impossible to read. He carried himself with effortless confidence, like someone who had never needed to prove his authority because everyone already accepted it. Ethan lowered his gaze respectfully as he approached, silently repeating every detail he could remember. The emperor barely spoke during the ceremony. He valued honesty. He hated manipulation. He noticed everything. Just do not give him a reason to notice you. Easy enough. At least that was the plan. As Ethan finally reached the altar, he dared one cautious glance upward. Adrian was already looking directly at him. Those steady gray eyes remained fixed on Ethan for several long seconds without a single change in expression. Why is he staring at me? Did I already mess something up? Please do not let this be the part where the story goes completely off the rails. The thought flashed through Ethan's mind before he could stop it. Adrian blinked once. It was so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but Ethan caught the tiny reaction immediately. Strange, Adrian thought silently, except Ethan somehow felt that thought was not his own. No, that was impossible. Ethan quickly dismissed the feeling and focused on the officiant who began reciting the traditional vows. The ceremony continued with flawless precision. Every noble watched in respectful silence while the palace choir filled the chapel with warm harmonies. Ethan answered each question exactly as he believed Lucian would have answered, speaking softly, carefully choosing every word. Outwardly, everything appeared perfect. Inwardly, however, Ethan's thoughts refused to stay quiet. I only have to survive this ceremony. Then avoid every noble gathering. Never argue with anyone. Never trust smiling politicians. Definitely stay away from Count Hawthorne because he starts half the problems in the original story. Adrian's gaze shifted ever so slightly. Count Hawthorne, standing several rows away, frowned without understanding why the emperor had suddenly looked toward him. Ethan remained completely unaware. The officiant invited both of them to exchange ceremonial rings crafted from white gold. Ethan accepted the ring with steady hands, but inside his thoughts raced again. Please fit. Please fit. If this ring falls on the floor, everyone will think it is a terrible omen. The ring slipped perfectly into place. Ethan almost sighed with relief. Adrian, however, looked at him a fraction longer than etiquette required. There it is again, Adrian thought, that same unfamiliar voice. It is not spoken aloud. Then where is it coming from? Before Ethan could celebrate surviving the ceremony, the emperor calmly offered his hand to lead his new spouse through the final imperial tradition. The warmth of Adrian's gloved hand was steady and reassuring, yet Ethan completely missed the quiet realization forming behind those unreadable gray eyes. From the very first moment they had met, the emperor had heard every anxious thought Ethan believed he had kept entirely to himself. The celebration continued as palace attendants escorted the newly married couple through magnificent corridors lined with enormous portraits of former emperors. Every painting seemed to watch Ethan pass, making him feel as though the entire palace had already formed an opinion about him. Nobles bowed respectfully as Adrian walked by, but many of them stole curious glances toward Ethan before quickly looking away. Their expressions matched exactly what Ethan remembered from the novel. Some expected him to embarrass himself. Others expected him to become another temporary figure in the imperial household. Almost none of them expected him to survive the complicated politics waiting behind the palace walls. Fine by me, Ethan thought. The less anyone expects from me, the easier it will be to stay out of trouble. Adrian continued walking beside him without changing his calm expression. Yet inside his mind a single question became impossible to ignore. The voice again. Clear. Honest. Entirely different from the quiet Omega standing beside me. They entered an elegant reception hall where sunlight poured through towering windows overlooking perfectly trimmed gardens stretching nearly half a mile across the imperial grounds. Crystal glasses sparkled on long banquet tables while musicians performed soft orchestral music that filled the room without overwhelming conversation. Servants moved gracefully between guests, offering tea, fruit, and beautifully prepared desserts. Everything appeared peaceful. Ethan knew better. In the novel, almost every conversation during the reception carried a hidden purpose. Every compliment concealed curiosity. Every smile measured weakness. Every harmless question tested loyalty. Keep your answers short, he reminded himself. Never volunteer information. Smile when necessary. Count Hawthorne approached first, wearing an expensive navy coat decorated with silver medals. His warm smile looked perfectly sincere, but Ethan immediately remembered that the Count enjoyed collecting rumors more than jewels. "Your Imperial Highness," the Count said politely, bowing toward Ethan. "The palace feels brighter today." "That is definitely not true," Ethan thought. "You are already looking for something to use against me, are not you?" Adrian lifted his teacup slowly to hide the faintest hint of surprise. The Count continued smiling, completely unaware that another conversation existed beyond spoken words. Ethan answered carefully. "You are very kind, Count Hawthorne. I hope to learn from everyone here." Safe answer. Neutral. Nothing suspicious. "Please leave." Hawthorne nodded before excusing himself, though disappointment briefly crossed his face, as if Ethan had failed to provide the dramatic reaction everyone expected. "Interesting," Adrian observed silently. "His spoken words and inner thoughts agree. There is no deception." More guests arrived one after another. A duchess praised Ethan's elegant appearance. A senior minister welcomed him into the imperial family. Several younger nobles whispered while pretending not to stare. Ethan answered every greeting with calm courtesy, while privately analyzing each encounter according to memories from the novel. Adrian listened without interruption. The strange inner voice continued offering observations that no one else could possibly hear. "That minister secretly supports tax reform. Do not trust the Duke with the emerald cane. The lady in blue actually seems nice. I wish someone would tell me where the nearest exit is because I have smiled so much my face hurts." Adrian almost smiled. Almost. It had been years since anyone inside the palace had surprised him. Yet this mysterious stream of thoughts carried no rehearsed ambition, no hidden flattery, and no calculated fear. Instead, it revealed genuine concern, unexpected humor, and knowledge that should have been impossible for Lucian Ashcroft to possess. As the reception drew toward its conclusion, Adrian finally turned toward Ethan with the same composed expression he had worn throughout the ceremony. "You seem remarkably calm today," he said quietly. Ethan forced a polite smile while his heart skipped. "Please do not ask difficult questions on the first day. I am making this up one step at a time." Adrian held Ethan's gaze for another silent moment. The mystery surrounding his new spouse had only deepened, and for the first time in many years, the Emperor found himself genuinely eager to discover what secret stood behind the honest voice only he could hear. After the reception finally ended, Ethan expected servants to escort him directly to the private residence prepared for the imperial spouse. Instead, Adrian quietly changed direction, leading him through a peaceful stone walkway that overlooked the western palace gardens. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of blooming roses, while a marble fountain sent gentle ripples across a clear, reflecting pool nearly 50 feet wide. The sudden silence felt almost unsettling after hours of smiling at strangers. Ethan walked half a step behind the Emperor, carefully matching his pace. "What happens now? Please tell me there is not another ceremony. My social battery officially stopped working 2 hours ago." Adrian remained perfectly composed, although another unexpected thought made its way into his mind. He complains in silence more honestly than most nobles speak aloud. They eventually reached a quiet pavilion overlooking the gardens. No guards stood nearby. No servants followed them inside. Only the distant sound of birds and flowing water remained. Adrian gestured toward a pair of carved wooden chairs. "Please sit." Ethan obeyed immediately, keeping his posture straight while his mind searched through memories of the novel. This meeting never happened. The Emperor was supposed to spend the rest of the wedding day attending council matters. Why is he here instead? Did changing one tiny decision already alter the story? Adrian poured tea into 2 porcelain cups with practiced precision. "You handled today's ceremony well," he said calmly. "Many people expected a different outcome." Ethan accepted the tea with both hands. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Safe. Respectful. Do not say anything strange. Adrian watched him quietly. The spoken answer remained perfectly appropriate. The thoughts behind it, however, continued flowing without restraint. He is watching every little movement. Is this normal? Maybe all emperors are naturally intimidating. If he asks me about politics, I am finished. I barely remember enough history to pass a college exam, let alone run an empire. Adrian almost laughed, an action so unfamiliar that even he found the impulse surprising. Instead, he asked another simple question. Are you comfortable inside the palace? Ethan nodded politely. Everyone has treated me with kindness, mostly because they are waiting to see whether I embarrass myself later. Still, I will take polite smiles over open hostility any day. The emperor lowered his cup thoughtfully. Every answer matched the hidden voice perfectly. There was no contradiction, no manipulation, no attempt to flatter him beyond basic courtesy. It was refreshing. Before either of them could continue, hurried footsteps approached the pavilion. A young palace secretary stopped just outside before bowing respectfully. Your Majesty, the Eastern Archive reports that a storage shelf collapsed after the afternoon inspection. Several important census records may have been misplaced. Ethan's eyes widened almost instinctively. Wait, that archive accident happened much later. In the original story, it was never an accident. Someone switched the financial records during the confusion. If that happens today, half the court will spend months blaming the wrong officials. Adrian remained silent, but his attention sharpened immediately. The secretary continued waiting for instructions while Ethan desperately tried to keep his expression calm. Do not say anything. You cannot possibly know this. You will only make yourself suspicious. Stay quiet. Adrian stood slowly before turning toward the secretary. Seal the archive immediately. No documents are to leave the building until I personally review the inventory. The secretary bowed. At once, Your Majesty. As the young official hurried away, Ethan stared at Adrian in complete confusion. That was not how the original story unfolded. If the archive is sealed now, the records cannot be replaced, which means the conspiracy never begins. Ethan felt a chill run through him. One quiet decision had already changed the future. Across the pavilion, Adrian observed the astonishment hidden behind Ethan's composed expression. The mysterious voice had once again predicted something before anyone else, and for the first time, the emperor began to wonder whether the greatest secret inside the palace was not hidden within forgotten records or ambitious nobles, but inside the quiet Omega sitting only a few feet away. The palace settled into a peaceful evening, but Ethan quickly discovered that silence inside the imperial residence never meant safety. As twilight painted the sky in shades of gold and deep blue, attendants escorted him through an elegant wing reserved exclusively for the imperial family. Every room looked more luxurious than the last, with polished hardwood floors, towering bookshelves, and wide windows overlooking gardens illuminated by hundreds of softly glowing lanterns. It should have felt welcoming. Instead, Ethan could not shake the feeling that invisible eyes followed every step he took. Somewhere inside this enormous palace, the original story had already begun to change. The archive records should have disappeared today, he thought while standing beside one of the windows. But they did not. That means someone out there is probably wondering why their plan suddenly failed. Whoever they are not going to give up after one mistake. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts before the chief attendant entered with a respectful bow. Your Imperial Highness. His Majesty requests your presence in the Western Library. Ethan blinked in surprise. Another private meeting? That definitely was not in the novel. Either I accidentally impressed him, or he suspects something. Hopefully the first one. The Western Library occupied nearly an entire floor of the palace, its towering shelves stretching almost 30 feet toward a painted ceiling covered with constellations. Thousands of carefully preserved books filled the room with the comforting scent of old paper and cedar. Adrian stood near a large map spread across a polished table, reviewing several official reports before calmly looking up as Ethan approached. Thank you for coming, Adrian said. Ethan offered a respectful bow. Of course, Your Majesty. Adrian studied him for a quiet moment before sliding one sealed document across the table. Read this. Ethan hesitated only briefly before opening the report. It described the inspection of the Eastern Archive completed only minutes earlier. Every financial record remained exactly where it belonged. Every census document had been accounted for. Not a single page was missing. Ethan struggled to hide his surprise. It really changed. One decision changed everything. Adrian noticed the silent reaction immediately. "Does the report surprise you?" he asked. Ethan carefully placed the document back onto the table. "I am simply relieved the records were protected." "Good answer. Please accept that answer." Adrian remained thoughtful. Again, the spoken response matched the hidden voice perfectly.
No contradiction. No hesitation.
It was as though Ethan possessed knowledge that existed before the event itself. Rather than pressing further, Adrian changed the subject. "The palace can be difficult to understand during the first few weeks. If you need anything, you may ask me directly." Ethan looked up in genuine surprise. "That is unexpectedly kind. I thought emperors in fantasy novels only spoke in mysterious one-sentence conversations before disappearing dramatically." Adrian lowered his eyes toward the report to hide the faint curve threatening the corner of his mouth. For reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan's honest thoughts made the vast palace feel strangely less lonely. Just then another official hurried into the library and bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, we have completed interviews with every archive employee. One clerk resigned unexpectedly less than an hour ago and cannot be located." Ethan's heartbeat quickened. There it is. Someone involved just disappeared. The conspiracy is still alive. It only changed direction. Adrian slowly folded his hands behind his back while silently listening to the anxious thoughts flowing beside him. The missing clerk was no longer the most interesting mystery inside the palace. The quiet Omega standing only a few feet away continued to know things that should have been impossible, and Adrian had reached a decision of his own. Until he uncovered the truth, he intended to keep Ethan closer than anyone else inside the imperial court. The following morning arrived with an unexpected sense of calm that Ethan found almost suspicious. Sunlight filtered through tall windows as attendants prepared breakfast inside the private dining room overlooking the eastern gardens. Fresh bread, fruit, and fragrant tea covered the long table, yet Ethan's attention remained fixed on the palace beyond the glass. Somewhere outside, someone had already realized their carefully planned scheme had failed. They would not simply disappear. They would adapt. They always did in stories like this. "I changed one event yesterday," Ethan thought while absent-mindedly stirring his tea. "That means I cannot rely on the original plot anymore. Every prediction becomes less reliable from this point forward." Across the table, Adrian quietly reviewed official correspondence while pretending to focus entirely on the reports. In reality, every anxious thought drifting through Ethan's mind only strengthened the questions that had occupied the emperor since the wedding. No court advisor had warned him about the archive. No investigator had uncovered the missing clerk before the inspection. Yet Ethan had reacted as though both outcomes had been inevitable. Adrian finally folded the last letter and looked toward him. "You seem distracted." Ethan immediately straightened his posture. "I was simply admiring the gardens, Your Majesty. Nice recovery." Hopefully he believes that because I definitely cannot explain that I am trying to calculate how much the future has changed. Adrian lowered his cup to hide another almost imperceptible smile. Honesty hidden beneath careful manners. It was becoming strangely familiar. Before either of them spoke again, a palace librarian entered carrying a stack of beautifully preserved journals. "Your Majesty, these are the historical records you requested." Adrian nodded. "Leave them here." Once they were alone again, Adrian slid one journal across the table toward Ethan. "This volume records the early history of House Ashcroft." Ethan blinked. "Lucian's family? Why would he show me this?" Curious despite himself, Ethan opened the weathered book. Inside were detailed accounts of Lucian's parents, their charitable projects, educational reforms, and years of loyal public service. None of it resembled the cruel reputation attached to Lucian in the novel. Ethan slowly turned another page. Then another. The family had funded schools, restored villages after floods, and sponsored scholarships for children regardless of noble rank. This does not make sense. The novel barely mentioned any of this. They were described as arrogant opportunists. Adrian quietly watched Ethan's expression change from confusion to genuine disbelief. History is often shorter than truth, Adrian said calmly. Many people remember only the last chapter. Ethan looked down again. Additional records described how Lucien had spent years visiting hospitals, organizing relief supplies during harsh winters, and quietly paying debts for struggling families without asking for recognition. Almost none of those accomplishments had survived in popular memory. Instead, rumors born during political rivalries had gradually replaced facts until the generous young Omega became known only as the Empire's future villain. Ethan felt unexpectedly sad. He never deserved what happened. Everyone judged him without knowing who he really was. Adrian listened carefully as those thoughts echoed with unmistakable sincerity. There was no calculation behind them, only compassion. For the first time, Adrian began questioning his own assumptions about both Lucien and the mysterious soul now occupying the young Omega's place. Before Ethan could finish reading, another messenger arrived carrying sealed correspondence from the Imperial Council. Your Majesty, several nobles request an emergency meeting regarding yesterday's archive inspection. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. It is starting already. They lost one opportunity, so now they are creating another. Adrian accepted the letter without taking his eyes off Ethan. Prepare the council chamber, he instructed calmly. As the messenger departed, Adrian made another quiet decision. If hidden enemies were already adjusting their plans, then the safest place for Ethan was no longer behind palace walls pretending to remain invisible. From this day forward, the Emperor intended to keep him close enough to observe every impossible prediction, every unexpected insight, and every honest thought that only one person in the entire empire could hear. By the time the Imperial Council gathered that afternoon, word of the interrupted archive incident had already spread throughout the palace. Ministers, governors, and noble representatives filled the circular council chamber beneath a soaring domed ceiling painted with the history of the empire. Ethan quietly followed Adrian to the raised platform reserved for the imperial family, reminding himself that he was only supposed to observe. Stay invisible. Listen more than you speak. That strategy has worked so far. Hopefully it keeps working. Adrian took his seat without ceremony while Ethan settled into the chair beside him. Almost immediately, dozens of curious eyes shifted toward the newly married imperial spouse. Some held polite respect. Others carried unmistakable suspicion. Ethan recognized several faces from the original novel, including advisors who had quietly encouraged misunderstandings about Lucien for years. Strange, Ethan thought. They look much less intimidating in person than they did in my imagination. One elderly minister stepped forward and bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, while we are grateful the archive records remain secure, several council members believe the incident should now be considered closed. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Closed? No. That is exactly what the conspirators want. If everyone stops investigating now, they will simply choose another method. Adrian remained expressionless. Continue, he said calmly. Another noble cleared his throat. The missing clerk likely panicked after causing the accident. Pursuing the matter further may create unnecessary concern throughout the capital. Ethan lowered his eyes to avoid attracting attention. That explanation sounds reasonable, which makes it dangerous. Adrian quietly listened to every unspoken thought flowing beside him. The more Ethan silently disagreed with the council, the more interested Adrian became in hearing why. Finally, the Emperor asked a simple question without looking toward him. What do you think? The chamber fell completely silent. Ethan froze. Wait, is he asking me? Surely not. Please let him be talking to someone else. Unfortunately, every noble in the room had already turned toward Ethan. There was no escape. Ethan carefully chose his words. Your Majesty, I am inexperienced in government affairs. True. Very true. However, if someone abandoned their position immediately after an unusual event, it may be wise to understand why before reaching a final conclusion. That should be neutral enough. Hopefully nobody notices I am quietly agreeing with the investigation. Murmurs spread through the chamber. Several ministers nodded thoughtfully while others exchanged cautious glances. Adrian watched their reactions before speaking again. A reasonable observation. Ethan nearly sighed with relief. I survived. Barely. Across the chamber, however, one council member remained unusually quiet. Lord Vincent Mercer, a respected financial advisor known for his calm demeanor, studied Ethan with narrowed eyes. Unlike the others, he paid less attention to Ethan's words than to the timing of his advice. Too convenient, Vincent thought silently to himself, unaware that Adrian could not hear his mind. The Emperor, however, noticed the man's lingering stare. The meeting continued with discussions about provincial budgets, harvest reports, and trade routes, but Ethan gradually realized something unsettling. Several topics no longer matched the original novel at all. Decisions that had once created conflict were now being resolved peacefully because the missing archive records had never disappeared. Every change created another new future that Ethan could no longer predict with certainty. The story is breaking apart, he realized. I cannot depend on remembered events forever. I will eventually have to make choices without knowing what comes next. As the council finally adjourned, Vincent Mercer remained behind under the excuse of organizing documents. His eyes briefly met Ethan's before he offered a perfectly courteous smile. Ethan politely returned the gesture, but an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. That smile was different. It was not curious like the others. It was calculating. From across the chamber, Adrian noticed the exchange without missing a single detail. Someone besides the Emperor had begun paying unusually close attention to Ethan, and although that person could not hear the mysterious voice hidden inside the quiet Omega's mind, Adrian suddenly realized that protecting Ethan might soon become far more difficult than simply keeping him close. That evening, the palace hosted a small musical gathering for members of the imperial household, a tradition intended to ease political tension after difficult council sessions. Soft candlelight reflected across polished marble floors, while a string ensemble performed elegant melodies beneath high vaulted ceilings. The atmosphere appeared relaxed, yet Ethan noticed something had quietly changed. Conversations paused whenever he entered a room. Friendly smiles lingered a little too long. More people were watching him than before. Great, Ethan thought as he accepted a cup of tea from a servant. Staying invisible officially stopped working today. Adrian stood nearby speaking with several senior governors, but even while discussing provincial affairs, he never completely lost awareness of Ethan's thoughts drifting through the room. They had become an unexpected second conversation running alongside every public event. Across the hall, Lord Vincent Mercer maintained his courteous smile while observing Ethan from a respectful distance. He never approached directly. Instead, he watched how others reacted whenever the Emperor included Ethan in conversation. Vincent's instincts told him something unusual was happening inside the palace, even if he could not yet identify exactly what it was. During a brief intermission, the palace orchestra paused while guests wandered toward the open balcony overlooking the illuminated gardens. Ethan stepped outside, grateful for the cool evening air. Hundreds of lanterns floated across the reflecting lake below, creating the illusion of stars resting peacefully upon the water. For a few precious moments, the palace almost felt ordinary. I could actually get used to this view, Ethan admitted to himself. If only there were not secret conspiracies hiding behind every beautiful building. Footsteps approached quietly behind him. Ethan turned to find Vincent Mercer offering a respectful bow. "Your Imperial Highness," Vincent said warmly. "I hope palace life has been welcoming." Ethan returned the greeting politely. "Everyone has shown me great kindness. That is technically true. It is also technically true that half the palace is probably trying to figure me out." Vincent smiled pleasantly. "His Majesty seems to value your opinions." Ethan nearly laughed inside. If only you knew why. Outwardly, however, he remained perfectly calm. "His Majesty has been very generous." Vincent studied Ethan for another moment before asking a seemingly harmless question. "Forgive my curiosity, but have you always possessed such remarkable insight into complicated matters?" Ethan's heartbeat stumbled. That question came far too close. Careful. Very careful. I simply try to observe before speaking, he answered. Vincent nodded thoughtfully, but Ethan sensed the man remained unconvinced. After offering another courteous farewell, Vincent disappeared back into the reception hall. Ethan released a slow breath. That was uncomfortable. Adrian joined him on the balcony only seconds later. Lord Mercer asked unusual questions, the Emperor observed calmly. Ethan blinked in surprise. You noticed? Adrian looked toward the lanterns floating across the water. I notice many things. You definitely notice too many things, Ethan thought instinctively. Adrian almost smiled again. Before either of them continued, hurried footsteps echoed across the marble floor. The chief palace attendant approached with visible concern before bowing deeply. Your Majesty, we have located the missing archive clerk. Ethan immediately looked up. Already? That happened much sooner than expected. The attendant continued. He has returned voluntarily. However, he insists that he remembers nothing about leaving the archive or disappearing afterward. He claims the last thing he recalls is organizing documents before the shelf collapsed. Ethan's mind raced. That is impossible. Unless… Wait. In the original story, there was a single hidden chapter mentioning someone who manipulated memories to erase evidence. I thought that subplot had been abandoned by the author. Adrian heard every anxious thought without missing a single word. His expression remained calm, but inwardly the final piece of the puzzle shifted into place. Ethan had just revealed knowledge about events that had never been reported, details that no ordinary witness could possibly know. Standing beneath the lantern-filled sky, Adrian silently realized the mystery surrounding his gentle spouse had become far greater than simple intuition, and somewhere inside the palace, another unseen player had already begun moving pieces across a game board that only Ethan seemed capable of recognizing before anyone else. The following morning, Adrian summoned only Ethan to the private observatory overlooking the highest terrace of the imperial palace. Morning light poured through enormous glass windows, illuminating shelves filled with star charts, navigation instruments, and journals collected by generations of emperors. The room felt peaceful, isolated from the endless movement below. Ethan immediately sensed this meeting was different. There were no advisors waiting. No attendants remained inside after the doors quietly closed. Just the two of them. This cannot be about breakfast, Ethan thought nervously. He definitely figured something out. Adrian stood beside the largest window with his hands folded behind his back. For several silent moments, he simply watched the capital awakening beneath the palace, allowing the quiet to settle between them. Finally, he spoke. You have changed many things in only a few days. Ethan carefully chose his answer. I have only tried to avoid making mistakes, Your Majesty. That is technically true. It is also definitely not the whole truth. Adrian slowly turned toward him. The archive, the council discussion, the missing records, the forgotten history of House Ashcroft. Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Each time, you reacted before anyone else understood what was happening. Ethan forced himself to remain calm. Maybe he only thinks I have good instincts. Stay calm. Do not panic. Adrian stepped closer, his expression remaining composed rather than accusing. You never seek power. You never ask for rewards. You never attempt to influence people for your own benefit. Ethan blinked in surprise. That observation was not what he expected. Adrian continued quietly. Instead, every choice you make prevents suffering before it begins. Ethan lowered his eyes. Because I already watched everyone lose everything once, he thought sadly. I just happen to remember a story that nobody else remembers. Adrian heard every word. The familiar, invisible voice carried no deception, only quiet regret. At last he understood why Ethan's thoughts had always sounded different from his spoken words. They were not rehearsed. They belonged to someone carrying memories no one else possessed. Adrian walked to a nearby table and opened an old leather journal. Inside rested handwritten notes from former emperors describing moments when history had unexpectedly shifted because one ordinary decision changed countless lives. My ancestors believed that sometimes fate allows a single person to stand. At the crossroads between two futures, Adrian said softly. Most never realize they are standing there. Ethan looked at the journal with growing disbelief. Could they have known? No, that cannot be possible. Adrian gently closed the book. I do not know how you know what you know. Ethan's breath caught. Here it comes. He knows. I also do not intend to force an answer from you. Ethan slowly raised his head. Surprise replaced fear. Adrian met his eyes with complete sincerity. Trust cannot be demanded. It must be offered freely. Ethan felt an unfamiliar warmth settle inside his chest. Throughout the original novel, Adrian had always been described as cold and impossible to approach. Yet the man standing before him was patient, thoughtful, and unexpectedly kind. Maybe the novel misunderstood him too, Ethan realized. Maybe everyone only remembered the last chapter. A gentle knock interrupted the quiet moment. The chief attendant entered carrying a sealed message marked with the insignia of the Imperial Intelligence Office. Adrian opened it without hesitation. After reading only a few lines, his expression grew more thoughtful than concerned. Lord Vincent Mercer has requested permission to conduct a private inquiry into recent unusual events surrounding the palace. Ethan immediately understood the danger. He is connecting the pieces. If he keeps digging, he might discover something that cannot be explained. Adrian folded the letter before looking directly at Ethan once more. Whatever secret you are protecting, he said calmly, someone else has already begun searching for it. Ethan stared at the unopened future stretching before them, realizing that changing destiny had never been the greatest challenge. Protecting the truth from those determined to uncover it had only just begun.